We're joined by Ravi Agrawal, Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy, with Prime Minister Modi meeting Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin at the SCO, just as the US raises tariffs on India. Ravi will break down what's at stake for New Delhi and its balancing act between East and West. Ravi, thanks for joining us. My first question is, the US has just escalated tariffs against India. How does that change the dynamics at this SCO Summit? Does it risk pushing New Delhi, even if temporarily, closer to Beijing and Moscow?
To some degree. Look, I think India is going to be hurt by these tariffs, especially in sectors that would have relied a lot on American purchases. So think of gems, jewelry, carpet manufacturers. There is some pain that is coming India's way. And as we know, it takes many months, years to reorient supply chains. So even if India wanted to try and avoid American tariffs and build other relations elsewhere, let's say hypothetically China, Russia, that's going to take a lot of time. So on this particular visit, I don't imagine that any big near-term changes will emerge in terms of Indian supply chains. But the thing to look out for is longer-term reorientation. I think for India, everything that has come out of the Trump administration in this second term suggests that America isn't the reliable ally or partner that many Indian diplomats and policymakers had hoped for. Given that they now know that, they're going to start looking around. That process is going to take years, a reorientation of sorts. What I will say, however, is I hope it doesn't go too far in another direction, because longer term, America flip-flops. America could have a new leader in 3 years, but also longer term in terms of people-to-people ties, defense ties, technology ties, the technologies of the future. India still needs the United States and vice versa.
Ravi, do you think Washington, D.C. underestimates how these tariffs could affect India's foreign policy calculus, especially when India is also positioning itself as a key Indo-Pacific partner to the West?
Oh, absolutely. Look, every aspect of these tariffs do not make sense to me. I mean, so first of all, yes, I think it's a foreign policy mistake on the United States' part, but let's not forget the fact that these are tariffs that will hurt the American consumer. So we know from basic economics that what happens with tariffs is that they are basically a tax that is paid for at the port of entry. So if Walmart, hypothetically, is purchasing a bunch of Indian rugs and there's a 50% tariff on it, for Walmart to have it released from the port, it will have to pay a 50% tariff. It will then choose how much of that tariff to pass on to the American consumer. Now, India might end up taking and absorbing some of that pain. We know from looking at the price index of imports that so far exporters have not been bearing the cost of the pain. So a lot of this is on America so far, and we're going to see this show up on American inflationary data in the coming months. So a lot of this, Vedika, is an own goal on America's part. And I do think that there's been a fundamental miscalculation of how other countries see America and of the options that they have to make other deals elsewhere longer term. Trump responds to data. The data hasn't come in yet.
All right, moving away from DC and moving to SCO, the meeting, which is going to be an important one, with Russia now increasingly dependent on China and Beijing hosting both Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin, Ravi, are we likely to see a more RIC-style huddle, less about ideology, more about shared pressure from Washington?
Potentially, to some degree, but there are also as many differences between these countries as there are some similarities. I think in as much as Prime Minister Modi, President Putin, President Xi Jinping, as much as they may disagree with the tariffs on the part of the United States, there's that element of commonality between them. There are many things and many divergences between these leaders.
True.
Look, remember also, India ultimately will act in India's strategic interests. At many levels, Russia is a pariah state today. It can still sell oil to other countries, but that's primarily because you can't afford to take Russian oil off the market. But in many other senses, Putin, for example, can't travel freely to any country that's a signatory of the ICC. India isn't, the United States isn't, which is why he can come to these two countries. But Russia is still a pariah state, and India doesn't want to tie itself too closely to Russia, nor does India want to tie itself too closely to China in the future. So my guess from speaking with Indian diplomats and policymakers in the last few weeks is that India is going to try and retain optionality. If over the last 20 years, India has hewed closer and closer to the United States, it's going to reintroduce some other options into the mix, but without getting fully into bed with any other partner.
All right, let's talk about Indo-China ties now. What should we realistically expect, Ravi, from a Modi-Xi meeting on the sidelines of the SCO? Are these conversations substantive, or are they more about optics and signaling?
I think it's a bit of both. Look, optics matter. I think especially when the leaders of the world's two most populous countries meet, there are ripple effects downstream. It makes it easier for other leaders, for ambassadors, policymakers to open up their own talks, for them to follow the lead of what they see, the chemistry they see, the language that they will interpret and then use in their own communications. So optics matter, high-level leadership meetings matter. They are not everything. But that's why there have been a lot of precursor talks between the two sides. The foreign minister Wang Yi, of course, visited India recently. So I think a lot of groundwork has been laid, and some of that will entail, the correct wording to try and ease some of the border tensions. We've already seen the opening up of visas. We've already seen the two sides work towards resuming direct flights between the two countries. I think people-to-people ties will be a big part of any changes we'll see. But the rest, Vedika, I think, remains to be seen in terms of the language that these two leaders will use.
Now, the SCO brings together, Ravi, countries that often have deep rivalries, India and Pakistan. When it comes to mistrust, India and China. From your vantage point, does the grouping carry real weight, or is it largely symbolic?
I don't think it carries real weight, Vedika. This grouping is known more for what it stands against than what it stands for. Remember, Iran is a part of the SCO. Iran is, as we know, a state sponsor of Hamas, of Hezbollah. Iran has had maximum pressure sanctions imposed against it. Right now, there's the chance that Europe, the so-called E3 countries, might reimpose snapback sanctions on Iran going back to the years before the Iran nuclear deal. Iran also, as I was talking about Russia, somewhat of a pariah state globally. So there is a danger in many of these groupings, especially when you have countries that are seen by Europe and the United States as pariah states. There's a danger of being too close to them. And I think for India, which has over the years played its sort of multi-alignment card very cleverly of being close to the United States, but also dipping its finger into global South groupings, whether it's the SEO, whether it is the non-aligned movement, whether it is the expanding BRICS, all of that optionality that India has retained, it would be in its interest to retain that optionality. If it plays the anti-West card too strongly and closes the door to any sort of rapprochement with the United States, that would not be in India's interest. So if I were advising Indian policymakers, I would say, sure, attend the SCO, keep that option open, but you also want to make sure that you can try and improve ties with the United States, because longer term, that is where the technologies of the future lie, not the past.
India has consistently, Ravi, refused to endorse SCO initiatives like the Belt and Road. Now, does this undermine the SCO's unity, or does it actually highlight India's independent foreign policy posture?
Yeah, I think it definitely highlights India's independent foreign policy posture. China will obviously want every country that attends an SCO meeting to sign off on its foreign policy priorities. There's no reason for India to have to do that. And Belt and Road is essentially an extension of Chinese foreign policy, and in fact, Chinese domestic policy.
Yes.
No matter what we see in terms of an easing of ties between India and China, there is no reason for India to completely sign up for everything that China is trying to do. Remember, at least in terms of the South Asian neighborhood, China remains a massive rival for India. China is jostling for influence with India in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Bhutan, in Sri Lanka, in the Maldives, in Pakistan, of course. In Afghanistan, even. These are all long-standing concerns for India, and there's no reason, no strategic reason for India to sign up to Chinese objectives. Again, India needs to figure out what makes sense for itself, for its interests, and it needs to respond to a climate of America first with India first. That is the only articulation that would make sense for it, and to retain some optionality again and again to be able to strike deals where it deems necessary.
Okay, let's talk about the border tensions for a moment. Ravi, given unresolved border tensions, can the SCO realistically serve as a platform, however limited, for de-escalation between India and China, or is that what you'd call wishful thinking?
I think it's wishful thinking. I think it's more likely that the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping will stand on its own. I think the SCO Summit in many ways is just an excuse for them to have this meeting. And the bilateral ties are far more important than the SCO. Your viewers will, of course, remember that last year, even though India hosted the SCO, it didn't really care that much about the summit itself. India was much more focused on the G20. So I would look at bilateralism as something that's much more important. I don't think America, though, is necessarily watching this summit too closely. America is fairly insular. America has its own designs on a rapprochement with China, by the way. When I was in Beijing recently, there were many Chinese diplomats who were wanting to ask about whether Trump would be willing to come to the United States for a summit with Xi Jinping. So again, India has to be very aware that no matter what it does vis-a-vis China, America is a very unpredictable player right now. And getting close with China doesn't necessarily mean that the two can align together against the United States. You don't know what the United States is going to do 2 months from now, 6 months from now. We're in a real era of policy uncertainty when it comes to the United States. And so I think India has to, again, look at every single instance in an a la carte manner and do what makes sense for it in a particular moment.
Is there also a risk, according to you, that India, by being seen alongside Beijing and Moscow, gets caught in the optics of alignment, even though its long-term strategic interests remain perhaps closer to the West?
It's possible. Again, I think, the optics will not be observed that closely in the United States. I can tell you one thing about American media. It does not closely follow these kinds of summits, these kinds of meetings elsewhere if the United States is not involved. America can be quite insular. So I don't think Americans are watching this summit. I don't even think American policymakers are going to focus too much on what is happening there. I think what American policymakers will care about is whether they have their own line open to India and whether they have their own line open to China.
Bottom line, does the SCO offer India a genuine platform then to project influence in Eurasia, or is it more stage managed by Beijing and Moscow?
It's a stage managed situation. I don't think the summit itself, the grouping itself, is something that is going to have a consequential impact on geopolitics this year, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. Again, there are more that divides the countries that are part of the SCO that unites them. These are all countries that have their own rivalries. It's very hard for them to agree on macro policy. Some of them might be disturbed by Trump's second term, but some of them will also be quite happy to strike deals with the United States were they to present themselves. So I, for one, would not take the SCO summit too seriously in terms of the summit itself, but would look much more closely at the dynamics between various leaders and various bilateral groupings within them and how that shapes policy choices.
Ravi, my last question, looking ahead, how do you expect India to balance its strategic autonomy between the Quad on one hand and the SCO on the other?
Look, I think the Quad in recent months has somewhat been weakened, and that is because India-US ties are troubled. US-Australia ties have also been troubled. And then US policy towards China has been a bit uncertain. It is very telling that the United States has put on hold some of its most stringent sanctions on China. And some of that is because China retaliated in the form of holding off exports of rare earth minerals, critical minerals, which it has a monopoly over. And by acting in force in some ways, they've put Trump at abeyance. And therefore, if you are a member of the Quad that's not America, so India, Japan, Australia, you have to question how enduring Trump's appetite to be tough on China actually is, and therefore how strong and unifying the Quad actually is. And I think Indian policymakers will be thinking about that quite carefully. The SCO is quite different. I just don't think the SCO is seen as a platform that is more than just the platform that allows people to meet each other. I don't think there are any wider strategies that unite countries within the SCO. So again, for India, policymakers will not be looking so much at these groupings as much as they will what are they getting out of it strategically, longer term? And what does that mean in terms of America's intentions and how they can make sure that they, on the one hand, stay on America's good side, get as much as they can out of that relationship without relying on it too much. So India will, if it was moving closer towards the United States, it is now going to take a little bit of a step back and advance optionality even more than it was before.
Ravi Agrawal, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Vedika.